First of all, just thank you to Billy and Sue and everyone at QQI and Nain for inviting me to come a very long way. Thank you all for giving your time. I'm really mindful of just how busy you are and how many other things are pressing upon your time. My name is Kane Murdoch. I'm a professional staff member. I'm the manager of the Student Conduct Unit at UNSW in Sydney. I previously was a kind of senior administrator in a big school of engineering, and then I took a role as an investigator, a senior investigator in the unit, and more recently became the manager of the unit about 18 months ago. So I've, in that time, really dug deep into contract cheating. One of the first cases that I ever got was Kath sending a link to some random pile of information which I was completely unsure of what it was. And it kind of set me off down a road. And in that time, since then, we've actually developed a lot of skill around identifying those kind of data sources. As we were saying in that video, like, look, where do you start looking? And then we've started building more kind of, I suppose, not so much a theoretical construct, but if you want to think of it like that, it might be useful. So that gives you a little bit of background on me, and we'll talk through some of the actual work that I've done and the team has done and how we've operationalised, you know, coming from a very low base, because we experienced the My Master thing just like every other university. And then we actually had to start asking ourselves the question, okay, what do we do now? You know, it's one thing to respond to the newspapers when they've asked us questions, but it's another thing to actually go, this is actually genuinely important for the well-being of our university, to not only be seen to be on top of this, but actually being on top of it, or at least as on top of it as we can be at any given point in time. So just a brief kind of agenda from my sessions here. As Billy mentioned before, it's Chatham House rules. I dread the idea of talking to you until I'm hoarse for 4 hours. So once we're done with Tommy, I'll invite questions, but beyond that, I'll invite, you know, questions generally through the floor rather than kind of limited sections. So I want you to be able to explore things that tickle your interest or, you know, you would really like some information on. I encourage you all to throw in your own views from your own institutions so everyone else can learn. I would hope that it's a relatively safe space and you can be as honest as you can without breaching confidentiality and such. We'll talk through some of the actual approaches to detection, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's probably as exhaustive as this group can really be able to digest in one day. I'll be talking in more detail with your people over the next 3 days. And in more technical detail, but I think it's actually really, really important. If there was one thing that I really want you to walk away with today, like, you know, you wouldn't be here if you didn't think contract cheating was a problem. I need you to be able to start thinking in terms of that institutional maturity. And what that means is that you have to be able to receive, or especially if you're actually making those kind of academic integrity decisions, but more if you're passing those down to other, delegating them, you need those people to be able to understand the types of information that they're going to receive if what I do in the next 3 days is successful. And finally, we'll talk about our Courageous Conversations program. As Billy also mentioned, once you start finding a lot of students, you start realising A, the scale of what you're facing, but B, exactly how time consuming that is and how resource intensive that is under very kind of legalistic or, you know, traditional academic integrity approaches. Like, when we think of academic integrity breaches as a very rare occurrence, it's easy to have a kind of long and, you know, drawn out and punitive process. It's another thing when you realise the scale of it, and I will talk to you a bit of a construct for thinking about that. So for the purposes of this session, we'll define contract cheating this way. It's not too much different from any other definition, but it's when the words don't go off the side of the slide. When a student engages a third party, paid or unpaid, to complete one or more assessments on their behalf. And look, there can be kind of micro versions of that, like CHEG, where they're really, say, in an exam and then they're getting a question. But if you just want to think about this just in terms of full assessments, that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to start with a quick poll. If you happen to have your phone or a computer here, please feel free to use the QR code. It's just taking your temperature about how confident you would feel if you had a big public cluster of contract cheating today, and how capable you might feel of responding to that and dealing with that. At the end, I'll show you how you rated yourself. It's all anonymous. No one's giving away any dangerous information. And we'll come back to it at the end, and I'll tell you how you thought at the start, and we can maybe take a temperature afterwards. Take a couple of minutes if you need. I've thrown you the technical challenges now.
Kane, you say it's anonymous, but the first thing it's doing is asking us for our name.
It says it can skip it. It's optional.
Okay.
I checked it. We'll take 30 seconds. Let me know if you're still having any issues. You can use the actual URL there. Is everyone good? Everyone accessed it? Beautiful. Okay. So I've used the gratuitous, beautiful Australian picture there, just because. Why am I here? What is particularly special about me or the Australian experience? And that's what I want to start by giving you that background. It's not just about my master. It's about what we've done as a sector following on from my master. And that, as we said in that video, that was 8 years ago. That's a fairly long time, you know, that's kind of a quarter of a career maybe, you know. And so I think it's worth all of us kind of understanding exactly some of the kind of basic steps that we took, and we can kind of get into more detail. So as you can see there, November 12, 2014, front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, one of Australia's biggest papers, and that's the headline, you know. And I think it goes without saying that universities were caught unawares, let's say, rather than pants down. And it went on, and as Kath mentioned, the two journos, they got access to, basically it was poor website security on the part of my master, and they got a trove of information. And what it did is implicate my uni, Sydney Uni, Macquarie Uni, I think it was 16 unis. And so then, you know, two things immediately on the first day. We have a big problem, and it's a problem that is pretty widespread, and it's shared. So no one looks good, everyone looks pretty poor, and it's how we actually go about responding to it. But it came out, dribble, kept coming out for 6 months. There was follow-up on all of those unis. So like, let's say UNSW had, I think we had 29 particular students. They're coming back to us in 6 weeks and going, how are those misconduct investigations going? You know, it's not the kind of thing that you can just plead privacy on, because it's already been on the front page of the paper. And so not only did you have a kind of internal processing from an academic integrity perspective, but you also had external pressure to be able to try and even deal with that. 70 uni students facing potential suspension. I'm not sure how many students your institutions suspend in any year, let alone having 70 arrive on one day, or 70 potential suspendees on one day. But that's both a lot of work, like it's actually depending on how effective your processes are. But it's also kind of a scary number to keep shooting up onto the front page of the paper. So at this point, TEXA, our higher ed regulator, the equivalent of QQI, they also saw the need to be able to get involved, to start to coagulate some activity in this area and to start pushing universities and holding them to account when they'd effectively, with all respect, we're blindsided by this. And so TEXA keeps us honest in that sense, and I would assume that QQI would play a similar role. I have another video which Billy and the crew had organised. This is Helen Ganneal. She is the head of the conduct unit in TEXA. And so they don't actually necessarily investigate anything, but what they're doing is coordinating the response across the sector and actually putting resources. They have $1.5 million, and I'm not sure what any equivalent is, but it's whatever is deemed appropriate with the problem. And she's going to talk to you only a couple of minutes, this one.
Hi, my name's Helen Ganneal, and I'm the Director of the Higher Education Integrity Unit in the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency in Australia, also known as TEXA. The Higher Education Integrity Unit was established in January last year after the Australian Government passed new legislation that makes it an offence to offer or advertise cheating services to students studying an Australian higher education award. The target of this legislation is the operators of the cheating services, whereas students who might make use of these services remain subject to their institution. The establishment of the Integrity Unit was the next step in a long journey for TEXA in combating the threat posed by commercial cheating services. In 2014, there was significant media attention in Australia about a website called My Master that was offering to write students' assessments for them. Some of Australia's biggest universities were named in this media article. In response, TEXA wrote to all registered higher education providers to alert them to the threat posed by this website and others like it, but also to ask the institutions to let us know what measures they had in place to support the integrity of the awards that they were conferring to students. Following these submissions, in 2017, TEXA published the Good Practice Note, Addressing Contract Cheating to Safeguard Academic Integrity, which brings together examples of best practice from across Australia's higher education system. Australia learnt a lot of hard lessons from the My Master incident. It was the first time that the sector had really had to grapple with students cheating in this way by outsourcing assessment items. And it was also the first time that it really reached into the consciousness of the Australian public. Although not every institution was named in the media articles, it did have the effect of impacting the reputation of the entire Australian higher education system. The Higher Education Integrity Unit was established to support providers combat threats to the integrity of higher education, including the threat posed by commercial cheating. We really see our role as supportive and in trying to support institutions to combat a threat that affects everybody. The work of the Integrity Unit is organised under 3 pillars of education, enforcement and detection. We try to detect as many of these sites as possible, and we maintain a database that we share with our sector and with international partners listing these sites. At last count, there was nearly 3,000 of these websites. We monitor the web analytics so that we know which of these sites are the big players for Australia, receiving the most traffic, and that allows us to triage these sites for action. The legislation provides for prosecutions with penalties up to 2 years imprisonment or fines of $110,000, and also provides TEXA with the power to seek injunctions that would block access to websites. The enforcement part of our work is then identifying prosecution targets and also injunction targets, and we also work closely with social media companies to try and get advertisements for cheating services removed from their platforms. In terms of education, we see a really important role for our unit in ensuring that all institutions have the skills and capabilities to identify cheating and the policies and procedures in place to take action. We do this through supporting best practice in the toolkit that I mentioned, but also through developing things such as detection guides to help academic staff identify contract cheating. We also do work with students where we have resources on our website that help students understand how to identify contract cheating sites and what they can do when they are approached by a contract cheating site, including reporting it to us so that we can triage it for action. The Integrity Unit and TEXA more broadly really values our international partnerships. Contract cheating is definitely a global industry, and it's a problem that we stand a much better chance of winning against when we all work together. We work closely with the QQI, and it's fantastic to see this initiative that they've pulled together. I hope you get a lot out of your day, and thanks for listening.
As you can see, there's kind of layers to this. There's a federal regulatory layer, and they support us. And then there's the university, people like yourself who are fundamentally responsible for policies, for the overall framework in which work happens, as it were. And, you boil down to somewhere around me where, the detection work happens and the actual, issuing of outcomes. We tend to not use words like penalties, and it's not because we're avoiding a word like that. And I'll explain to you why. It's related to the courageous conversation. But one thing that our university did, not all have, so each university has its own structures and limitations and resourcing and choices as well. Sometimes they would just prefer to have, say, a group of academics or individual academics doing this academic integrity work. My university chose to create a unit to be specifically responsible for handling serious concerns of academic integrity breaches. And I'll go into a little more detail after about what I consider serious. I think it goes without saying that contract cheating is serious. But at the moment, I have 8 case managers, let's call them investigators, and I have 5 senior case managers and 3 case managers. That's just to give you a sense of the scale. As I said, having the choice to have academic investigators, that is a choice, it's perfectly fine. But I think it's also notable that they're more expensive on the whole than my team is. And there's not often such a kind of a grouping, like they might usually work, alone or in a small group. So they maybe the engineers work together, but there won't be that kind of total clearinghouse of information, which my group actually has. So one of the lessons today, doesn't matter who it is, as long as they're appropriately trained, but make it someone's job. I think when we go here, Joe Blogg's academic, I want you to be the ethics officer or the academic integrity officer, but they don't get much of a workload allocation and they're not paid anything different. They're going to make the perfectly rational decision to prioritise other things like research or teaching, which might lead them to promotion. That's not a criticism of the system, it's just a fact. So what you do see is the odd rare individuals who become genuinely invested in, for their own reasons, but also, just because they want to do the right thing. But when you don't incentivise any of it, it's leaving you at a disadvantage, would be my lesson. So make it someone's job, make it worth their while. So one of the things that came as a result of making it someone's job, my job and my team's job, is that, and it wasn't a growth in cheating, it wasn't a massive upswing in cheating. What it was an upswing in detection. That's what that number represents. And there were other headlines who, cheating up at UNSW, and of course a DVCA, a registrar, does not want to see those kind of headlines. This is preferable. They would probably rather the words cheating in their university never appeared in a news article ever, but sometimes that's just out of their control. Incidentally, I think the top headline came out of a talk given by an academic, and the second headline came out of a leak from a senior committee in our university. It wasn't really in anyone's control as such. But nonetheless, that's the result. When you actually start looking for contract cheating and when you start developing skills, it's not like the first day, if you put a team together and you went, okay, go, that they would by the afternoon be finding contract cheating. What it is getting them a starting point. But I would hope that what you get out of today gets you a more advanced starting point than my unit had 6 years ago, because it was a very challenging kind of period where you knew this thing was happening, you would receive reports about it, and we'll talk about those reports. Like, for the most part, they were from academic markers. But what got reported and what the outcomes were, there was quite a big gap there. And what we've done is try to fill in the gap, to create a bridge between those two things. So Billy mentioned it before, but what the research from Australia, then that's another, again, I suppose it's both a university and also a sector-wide response. The fact that we had researchers, they might have been researching something, slightly different, something parallel, but all of a sudden they found interest in this as a research topic. And there's been a range of different research. You might all know of Tracy Brettag and her colleagues who did the major surveys of Australian students and staff around contract cheating. And so that 2018, that big survey came back with about 6%, 6 to 7%, somewhere in that region. And more latterly, the research that Guy Curtis released this year, using a different method, came back with around 10%. So again, self-reporting, that's going to undershoot what the real number is, whatever that is. You could only take a guess at how far under it is. But at least you know if you go 10% of all of your students, make that assumption. Don't assume your students would do it. Well, those rotters down the road, of course. That's not the case. Like, students have a lot of reasons and there's a lot of drivers for why they engage in these behaviours. So we need to grapple with that reality. And if you're finding, so I think at one point not so long ago, we were probably finding 1%. That leaves 90% of the cheating still occurring without any kind of sanction or any kind of breach being even detected, let alone actually actioned. So the business model, and again, a lot of the talk around contract cheating is about these differing business models. Billy mentioned, the social media kind of spamming out at people. If anyone's on Twitter, go ahead and write something like, oh man, I'm really running late for this assignment, and see how many bots come back to you. That was a little eye-opener the first time that happened. And it's a joy to watch academics discovering it year after year. Like, for about 4 years I've been watching academics discover this on Twitter, because they'll just be writing a generic tweet about something and then all of a sudden a whole bunch of bots come back and offer to write their essay. And I'm like, I think they've got it covered. But it's not just the essay mills. So what we've experienced, and a big part of that 2,000%, was actually more from a student's perspective, a more holistic service. Like an essay mill, you might imagine, go to a website, stick in a question, give them your credit card and your email, and you get shot back a file. Now, it's actually quite a bit beyond that. So we've seen many examples, not just a few, many examples of students having some or all of an entire course done for them. So they've actually passed over their login credentials, and on some occasions, you can literally see that the student walked away and came back at the end to check their grades. So when we talk about scale, that is the scale of the business model. We'll dig a little deeper into that mode a little later. As I mentioned, CHEG is, to my mind, it's a kind of micro version of contract cheating. And I think a big part of the driver from the university side for why that works is because of poor assessment design. Now, you won't design out contract cheating. Let me just push that one away. You will not design it out, but you can definitely design it in. You know, you can actually leave things so prone to the kind of abuse that contract cheating delivers that you can bake it into your student experience and your assessment experience. So having a close eye on assessment is absolutely crucial from your perspective. So, as I said, sorry, I should have moved on the next slide. So the answer is no. We can't design it out, but we can take concrete steps to minimise it, to make it less likely to happen in any given situation. One of the situations that will ensure that your course or your area can have contract cheating occurring is repetition. Endless repetition of the same assessments is extremely poor practice. I think you would all agree on that anyway, but it actually presents a significant risk to the likelihood of contract cheating occurring. So, what does staff think? As I mentioned, Tracy Brethag and her colleagues ran a big staff survey. It was about 1,800 staff across, most of the unis in Australia. And the results were quite interesting. These are academic staff, just by the by. So the results were quite interesting. I think that what you saw is that they were aware of it, they were aware this thing is happening, and I'm sure now, 4 years later, that your staff would be even more aware than our staff were 4 years ago. But this, to me, was the most interesting data point. Nearly 60% of them didn't think you could prove it. And so, and you might, I'm taking a guess here, but I'm going to guess that you consider at this point academic staff to be the front line of your detection efforts. Would that be a fairly... If those results bear out, 60% of the people that you have detecting don't believe it can be done. That's not a good starting point. That's a, pretty dreadful kind of pit of the stomach starting point, really. So I will talk to you a little bit about how the role, an appropriate role of academic staff. I think they do have a big role to play, but I think using them solely as the means of detection is an error.